Good evening, depending on where in the world you are. Welcome to the first event, the Brazilian event of the campaign No to the Cold War, an event organized by the No Cold War campaign and by the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. My name is Marco Fernandes. I am one of the organizers of the campaign and a researcher of the Tricontinental Institute. This event is held in partnership with TVT, the Workers' Television, Brasil de Fato newspaper, and the Chongyang Institute in China, all three responsible for the stream in Portuguese, Mandarin, and English in the YouTube channel of the No Cold War campaign. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon. My name is Tings Chak from the Tricontinental Institute of Social Research, which is an international institute oriented by people's organizations focused on stimulating the intellectual debate at the service of people's aspirations. We have offices in São Paulo, Buenos Aires, Johannesburg, and New Delhi. It is an enormous honor to be here with you, here virtually, and coordinate this panel with Marco. Okay, we are in Shanghai, China. We'll have participants here in China and in Brazil. To introduce very briefly what the campaign is, the No Cold War campaign, we observe the actions and statements ever more aggressive by the US government against China. They constitute a threat to world peace and are an obstacle for humankind to be able to deal with common problems, extremely serious problems that confront us, like climate change, pandemic control, racist discrimination, and economic development. Therefore, we believe that any new Cold War would be totally contrary to the interests of humanity. Instead of that, we are in favor of the maximum global cooperation so as to confront the enormous challenges of humanity. So therefore, we call upon the US government to step back from this threat of a new Cold War, stop pressuring other countries from adopting such dangerous positions. We wish China, US, and Brazil can base their relations on dialogue and centering on the common issues that unite humanity. If you want to know more about our campaign, access our site nocoldwar.org, and there you can find out more about what we've been doing in the last few months. We began last year, started in England and in the US, but now has spread to various parts of the world, including Latin America. So now we are here with a debate, a Brazil-based debate with a special guest from China, Professor Wang Wen, and former President of Brazil, Dilma Rousseff. So what is the proposal? During the government of the Workers' Party, Brazil became an important actor on the international setting, Latin America and international setting, especially through its role in Mercosur, BRICS, UNASUR, and CELAC. President Dilma and President Dilma Rousseff had, with Foreign Minister Celso Amorim, made much effort to develop a new multipolarity in world policy, working in close proximity with China. President Lula at the Puebla Group recently stated, "I am convinced that the US will never tolerate the protagonism of Latin American countries. Since the 2016 coup, Brazil has distanced itself from the BRICS coordination and realigned with the United States. At the same time, in the last year, bilateral trade between Brazil and China reached a record amount of 553 billion reais, and Brazilian surplus increased 7.3% last year, reaching 190 billion reais. In other words, Brazil's surplus with China is 70% of our whole trade surplus. In the case of the pandemic, Brazil signed agreements to produce the Chinese vaccine, CoronaVac, and AstraZeneca with Britain. But we know that the inputs, the ingredients, come only from China, making the Brazil-China relation even more fundamental at this moment of the pandemic. Perhaps because of this, President Bolsonaro, in recent months, had reduced the inflammatory nature of his discourse against China, but just recently, in last couple of weeks, he has raised the stakes once again with an inflammatory speech against China. So we want to raise the following questions for this debate. What should be the next chapters of Brazil-US-China relations in the context of the new administration, in other words, the Biden presidency, and also in the development of the pandemic? Now, second question, how to develop an independent foreign policy for Brazil? And the third, how can individuals and organizations make a contribution to the No Cold War campaign? As you can see, we managed to bring together a very special group of leaders, political intellectual leaders from Brazil and China, with, of course, the highlight of the illustrious presence of our President Dilma Rousseff. And so how will this work? Each speaker will have 10 to 12 minutes, with the exception of President Dilma, who will make the opening speech around 20 minutes. So we prepared a few questions for each speaker as suggestions, of course, but they are free to add other elements to their contributions. We opted to not have a debate for the event to not to be too long, but we hope this is the first of many events of the No Cold War campaign. There will be other opportunities for debate. Okay, so no Q&A this time. So today I'm going to introduce briefly our guests by the order in which they will speak. So first, President Dilma Rousseff, then Minister Celso Amorim, who was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Brazil and Defense in the Lula and Dilma government. Unfortunately, Minister had a personal engagement last minute, and he won't be with us live, but he sent us a video, which we will show. We have a very special guest from China who will speak to us directly from Peking, Professor Wang Wen, Executive Director of the Chongyang Institute of the People's University of China. Then will come Professor Monica Bruckmann of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, who was an aide to the General Secretary of UNASUR between 2011 and 2013, and who also contributes with the Tricontinental Institute. Next, we'll have Professor Elias Jabbour from the State University of Rio de Janeiro, who is a member of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Brazil. Lastly, one of the main leaders of the people's movements in Brazil are Comrade João Pedro Stellig, member of the National Coordination of the MST, the Landless Workers Movement of Brazil, the biggest people's movement in Latin America. So, without further ado, let us launch into our event. So, starting with our most illustrious guest, President Dilma Rousseff. So, I will suggest 3 questions for her to answer and add whatever remarks she wishes. So, Madam President, what were relations like between Brazil and China in the Workers' Party governments? What was the role and what is the role of the BRICS group today? And how to prevent a new Cold War? Thank you for your presence, President. Madam President, you have the floor. So first, I would like to greet Professor Wang Wen, Professor Monica Bruckmann, and Professor Elias Jabbour, member of the leadership of the Communist Party of Brazil. Also to greet my dear brother, comrade, João Pedro Stellig, one of the leaders of the MST, the biggest people's organizations in Brazil. So I'm going to invert the order of the question. So I think it's important to characterize that the new Cold, what is this new Cold War? Since the financial crisis of 2008, the conflict China-US became clear, whether through the policy of containment, which was implicit, which was veiled under President Obama, and the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, is an example of this veiled policy, but then openly and declaredly under President Trump, and now more diplomatic, with very aggressive streaks under the Biden presidency. Some people call this setting of new Cold War, but I believe this setting is marked by a huge difference between the post-Second World War Cold War and the current geopolitical moment involving this conflict. I think the setting that characterizes this conflict is, on the one hand, capitalism in its neoliberal phase, extremely financialized in the United States, which wants to impose a dynamic of growth based mainly on speculation, on financial speculation, and on the other side, major development of the socialism with Chinese characteristics, which leads to an extraordinary result in 30 years. So what is the main characteristic today is the economic recovery of China. And it is radically different, much faster than the US economic growth in the face of COVID. So China is growing 20% in relation to 2019. Its reserves have had significant increases, and the GDP grew 2.3% in 2020, while the US and European countries are between a drop of 4 to 10% in their GDP in 2020. So COVID pandemic in itself does not change the trends, but it does radicalize the most marked characteristics of what had been happening between the nations since then. Of course, there was a moment when the conflict didn't happen. It was the strategic opportunity stage, and in that period, from 79 to 2013, China grew at about 9.8% a year. And there were two moments, 91 and 2001 to 2013, at rates that were closer to, were above 10%. So this feature shows that in these 30 years, there was an immense expansion, a sort of prior accumulation of the Chinese economy, which led to growth, both of the private sector, the development of the special export zones in the south, and also a strong growth of the public sector based in strategic goods, like, for example, intermediary goods, oil, steel, aeronautic, and there was an increase in family agriculture, and also cooperatives and state farms, which meant a strong increase in the food production. For the first time in Chinese history, hunger ceased to be an issue. And so China just disappeared from the UN hunger map in 2014. Like Brazil and Indonesia, it's very important in the development of China, this standard: education, science, technology, and innovation. And this means that clearly there is a systematic effort to reduce distances, whether sending millions of students to the best universities in the world, whether modernizing and restructuring their own institutions with huge investments. In the United States, only 5% of university students study engineering, which contrasts with China, which is that 1/3 of students study engineering. This is very important because engineering provides the base for this innovative drive. In the education field, China has an excellent performance, which allows it to increase the capacity to sustain the growth in science, technology, and innovation. And China did this in agreement with the participation of the institutions of the US and Europe, both at the stage of the opportunity, of strategic opportunity, and in more recent years, considering that the strategic opportunity stage ended with the 2008 and 9 financial crisis. So currently, China produces more engineers than the US, Europe, Japan, and Taiwan, and Korea, South Korea together, and 6 times more than the US in number of engineers. This is extremely relevant. There is an open race to develop the global leadership in science and technology for the first time. This is taking place, particularly in artificial intelligence and other relevant fields like 5G and others. And you also have Wall Street Journal recognized that in the important field will be the holy grail, which is quantum computing. China has a relevant role.
So for the first time in the world's recent history, a country, which is China, is next to the US at the cutting edge of the greatest transformation of the 21st century, which is a technological revolution of AI and what is known as communication and information technologies. In addition, the Chinese economy, because of its size, represents 40% of the internet global transactions. All of this creates a space, a very important space, in this configuration of the new dispute that is being called the new Cold War. So this setting is a setting in which the most important part of the conflict will occur. And it's important for us to highlight that precisely the conflict of the United States trying to impede the arrival of 5G technology is actually a manifestation of this aspect. Another manifestation is the attempt to hinder the access of China to semiconductors, and especially those with smaller size of 3 to 7 nanometers. This is because the microchip wars will be a war in which international leadership will be decided. This area is very important for us to look at. It's not possible to understand this conflict if we don't understand that this is the most important realm of the conflict, not least because in the area of technology, China has great advantages. It's hyper-competitive, its private sector is hyper-competitive, the processes that took place, the technological absorption that took place in it, all that the US has copied, all that Japan and Germany has copied from China as well. And also, China has copied other countries' technologies. It's got its own drives and internal possibilities. So this explains this great need of the United States to concentrate its dispute in certain questions. And I think we must highlight the Huawei conflict, the struggle between the United States and Huawei trying here in Brazil to block the adoption of 5G. So here in Brazil, this is the case. This shows that this is very complicated from the point of view of cooperative relationships. Why? Because the USA doesn't have any alternatives to offer to Huawei's 5G technology. And Chinese 5G is much cheaper for developing countries such as Brazil. And in addition, today it has the potential to bring not only more speed to our interconnections and improve cellular phone services, but it's the main means of introducing Industry 4.0, so the fourth industrial revolution, because it has a smaller latency period and it allows a exchange of informations to be quicker. And this is vital in a world in where the Internet of Things will be vital. Just to give you an idea, robotics relationships on the shop floor in factories will be vital. So two robots talking to each other as quickly as possible with the smallest possible latency period is vital. So this is a fundamental aspect of this new conflict. On the other hand, the combination of the apprehension of machines and 5G will allow all production processes to be automated. This means that it will affect industrial processes, autonomous vehicles, smart cities, and a whole broadening of the digitalization of services. And this will transform the online and offline worlds in one single world. Therefore, what's in question in this dispute is who will lead the fourth industrial revolution, technological revolution, and who will have access to all of its benefits. At the same time, it's important to remember that it produces effects in the labor market, and as such, it will tend to aggravate, especially in neoliberal countries with neoliberal capitalism, it will tend to aggravate the massive dismissal of workers. It will aggravate the reduction both at the top, the middle, and the bottom of the pyramid of job opportunities. And as this is a human product, it will only be resolved in the political sphere. Therefore, the role of the state in each one of these economies is very important. When you have a reduced role of the state, there is no way of conducting this politically. Finally, I think that this view, well, there was a view, and I think it's still around. It's an extremely prejudiced view by the American deep state and the American elite regarding China, and it's based on two prejudices. The first prejudice is the prejudice of thinking that China, during all of this time of strategic opportunities, was a country that wasn't developed and that lacked the capacity to put itself forward as an alternative and on the level of development of the USA. This prejudice is based on another prejudice, which is the prejudice that says that as long as China doesn't jettison the Communist Party, without adopting a liberal democracy, it would not be able to carry out a sustainable development. And there lies a big mistake, because if you don't understand that the Chinese Communist Party is responsible for this extraordinary transformation, then it's difficult for you to understand how this process was possible. So this prejudice, I think, has been decreasing, and I think it was very much hit by the 2008-2009 crisis. Why? Because the deep state elites of the USA supposed that China would be presumed that China would be the focus of the crisis, and the focus of the crisis was the US. And so this unipolar world that arose after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Gulf War, the US placed itself as the center of the economical, financial, ideological movement. So in the 2008-9 crisis, there was a world that fell apart, the world of US hegemony. This is very important because this explains both the G20 and BRICS. BRICS and G20 were the reaction that the emerging economies gave to this fact. Of course, the responsibility for one of the most dramatic crises after 1929 was a process that happened in the USA, which is the financialization process, which made financial speculation the main basis of the economy. And it made it so that there were no long-term prospects, only short-term prospects. This short-term prospects mean that there's a decrease in science and technology investment, deregulation of financial markets, and it also imposes a huge inequality, which affected all countries of the world. Because the so-called Washington consensus started being imposed on countries. So Latin American countries, we all suffered the incursions of the new liberal agenda, which means a minimal state, a reduction of public expenditure on education, on health, etc. The BRICS and the G20 were a reaction to this moment in time. So if you look at what the BRICS were, they were precisely formed in the context of the 2008-9 economic crisis. In Brazil, we considered it vital to create this other pole in order to ensure, not to create a separate power, but to ensure multipolarity, to ensure that there be more balanced relationships, less asymmetrical relationships in the international setting, because asymmetrical relationships aren't equal to multipolarity. So there was a search to build the BRICS group, and this is the same search that led to the G20, and it had a specific aspect to it because it links, coordinates the four biggest economies, and then we saw the entry of South Africa. So it was Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So this creation was a result of a new conception of the need to have an international economic force to make existing relationships, less asymmetrical, especially in the financial and economic fields. So it made two things clear. So the institutionality that existed this far was inappropriate, was inadequate. For example, the forum, which was informal but became institutionalized, the G7, the IMF and the World Bank became inadequate as well because they offered insufficient representation to emerging countries in these discussions. From G7, we went to G20. And regarding the World Bank and the IMF, the responses of the BRICS were the BRICS Development Bank with $100 billion in capital and the Contingent Reserves Agreement, which was an agreement to ensure protection and stability for the BRICS countries in the face of international crises. This had a $100 billion fund which would be slowly integrated in all countries. But another aspect of the BRICS which is vital is that, as well as the BRICS agenda, which talked about food security, energy security, climate change, reduction in inequality in all countries, there was a coordination between the BRICS and regional institutions among the countries of the BRICS. So then there was a type of expansion of the BRICS in the face of these regional institutions, with meetings, for example, between the BRICS and Organization for the Cooperation of Shanghai, a group created in 2001, which gathered the leaders of China, Russia, and 4 Central Asian countries, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Turkmenistan. And this was something that happened straight away in the first meeting. There was that meeting also between the BRICS and the African Union when the BRICS meeting was in Durban in South Africa. There was a meeting, an UNASUR meeting with the BRICS when the meeting took place in Brazil, in the Fortaleza meeting in Brazil. The meeting was in Brasilia and then in Fortaleza with UNASUR. And in 2015 in Russia, there was a meeting with the Euro-Asian Economic Union formed by Belarus, Kazakhstan, Armenia, Uzbekistan, with the presence of Iran as well. All of these mechanisms, they aimed at this integration because the BRICS Bank, for example, it was presumed that it would also be a tool for supporting emerging economies, and it also gave subsidies for us to integrate ourselves in the question of the Silk Route, which at that time here in Brazil was basically the agreement of the Atlantic Pacific link via railways, in a way not just to overcome the Panama Canal, but to add to it. So the BRICS had a vital role. So to resume the BRICS, which is something strategic for Brazil, not least because one of the results of it was that there was a weakening of the BRICS because the B and the I elements of BRICS have suffered problems. B because of Bolsonaro, which has really threatened Brazil, and I because of an attitude of China, by India to, as Bolsonaro, it chose a similar route to Bolsonaro in relation to the USA. So Narendra Modi's government, being ultra right-wing, assumed a similar stance. So all of this shows the following, that our recovery would have to be necessarily political, So we need a transformation. I'm going to talk on behalf of Brazil. Here in Brazil, for us to have a recovery, a return to BRICS, not least because this is strategic for Brazil. Why? You talked about the commercial surplus, the over $500 billion, etc., and investments, but I'd like to talk about a different issue. I'd like to talk about Brazil's insertion in the global value chains. Latin America needs to strengthen itself.
Aos governos progressistas da América Latina veio se juntar o México, que não existia no período anterior. Então, a presença do Brasil pode permitir que aqui a chamada fábrica, como tem a fábrica Ásia, a fábrica Europa, a fábrica Canadá, Estados Unidos e México também, é necessário que tenha a fábrica latino-americana. E em se introduzir nas cadeias globais de valor, passa por uma relação, para que essa relação forte Brasil-China se transforme numa relação forte Latinoamérica-China. Uma relação em que pode ensejar a ampliação da capacidade de acumulação desses países latino-americanos. E aí eu vou fazer um paralelo entre isso, é óbvio que numa escala bem menor, e a estratégia de circulação dupla proposta pelo presidente Xi Jinping e que está sendo adotada e que é uma estratégia fundamental de combinação do crescimento do mercado interno e sua relação com o mercado externo. No caso da China, especificamente, isso é fundamental porque trata-se de modificar o padrão de crescimento. A dual circulation é, sobretudo, uma modificação no caráter do desenvolvimento e abre o caminho, no caso da China, para, além de uma economia moderadamente próspera, essa que superou e tirou da pobreza 100 milhões, os últimos 100 milhões de chineses, passa também pela construção de uma economia social. No caso dos nossos países, a combinação de uma circulação dupla, ela não leva, nesta fase que nós estamos, agora nós temos de ser levados a uma sociedade moderadamente próspera. Nós temos de sair deste processo de ampliação da desigualdade, de crescimento baixo. E temos de romper com o padrão neoliberal de financiarização, que tem uma dupla, aliás, tem um triplo motor. Então, que financiariza, reduz o papel do Estado, amplia a desregulação econômica e todas as desregulamenta mercado de trabalho, abre as riquezas naturais do país para, como é o caso da Amazônia, para o maior desmatamento possível. Enfim, tudo isso só é possível com transformação política. Hoje é necessário que o governo não tenha esse componente neofascista e neoliberal. Mantendo esse componente neofascista, neoliberal, o Brasil só irá destruindo as suas riquezas, destruindo a sua população, porque hoje o que nós vemos, diante da pandemia, são mais de 420 mil mortos e 19 milhões de brasileiros voltaram à condição de fome. Por quê? Nós tínhamos saído,
And we had, in 2014, we had taken Brazil out of the global hunger map of the United Nations, and now we are back at the hunger map because this partnership with China implies, with Russia, with India, with South Africa, it implies this relationship build with Celso Amorim, who will now explain the foreign policy that we had with other countries in the world, the strengthening once again of the G20, the rupture with this view, I would say, insensitive and non-humanitarian vis-a-vis the vaccines, which is the opposite of the Chinese attitude, which is having an extremely adequate vaccine diplomacy. And today in Brazil, we know this well because we are adopting almost 90% CoronaVac, the Chinese Brazilian vaccine, because the others are lacking. So all of this will imply necessarily a radical alteration of Brazilian politics. So I want to conclude by saying the following: BRICS will only go back to being BRICS with this change in Brazilian politics, and without that we cannot return to a better setting. Thank you, President Dilma, for this lecture, very clear about what is behind this attack of the US against China and the importance of multilateral organizations of the Global South that emerged in recent years, and the prospect of rebuilding BRICS. So now I'm going to hand over to Minister Celso Amorim, who will speak to us about a little bit about the history and the importance of the relations between China and Brazil. The world has undergone notable changes. These changes are not new. Many of them will be speeded up by the pandemic. We don't know how long it's going to last, what the responses will be, but many changes had already been happening. In 30 years, we had the end of a Cold War, the end of a bipolar world, the appearance of a hegemony of the United States, almost unchallenged for a long time, with the ascent of other powers and of the United Nations. And more recently, we started witnessing another tendency, which has two main aspects, I would say. One is multipolarity, the fact that there are many centers of power in the world. And so, therefore, we don't live in a world that is hegemonistic. The other tendency that is part of the first is specifically the rise of China. This is a major change, a momentous change. The Chinese economy has overtaken the American economy in purchase power parity, and over the course of the decade will overtake also in standard exchange rate terms. And this is speeded up by the pandemic itself. Furthermore, China has demonstrated something that the US lacked in recent years, and maybe was missing from other countries, which was the capacity of what US theoreticians call the white power, soft power, forgive me. So China, for different regions, has a major investment capacity and has directed major resources to infrastructure, works not only in Asia, but also in Europe and Africa. This gave China a lot of projection, a lot of strength, and the pandemic speeded up this process because China, although it was the country where apparently the pandemic began, on the other hand, it controlled it very quickly, and the economy recovered. So in 2020, it was one of the few large-scale economies that grew, and grew 2.3%, and probably will grow a lot more in 2021. So the United States had a strong recession. They are recovering now, but they will be very hard. Basically, they won't have the Chinese growth levels. So some theoreticians call the trap of Thucydides. It's a reference to the Peloponnesian War and the emergence of Athens as the major power, threatening the hegemony of Sparta. What the analysts talk about, they say that the war is inevitable. I don't agree. Neither Cold War nor a hot war. There's a world with tensions, but these tensions must be dealt with through dialogue and cooperation. The world today is no longer fit for Cold War. The Soviet Union and the United States and their respective allies, they were separate worlds. They almost didn't connect. To go from Vienna to Eastern Europe was really difficult. If depending on the passport you had, if you had the visa, they would give you a separate sheet of paper. Today, the world is completely integrated. It's impossible to isolate countries from each other technologically, and the challenges cannot be separated. For example, climate change. And health issues cannot be separated either, like the pandemic is demonstrating. So the world cannot withstand a Cold War, and it is not necessary. Of course, for it not to occur, many factors are required. Among them, the idea that no one should fight for a hegemony. We don't want to replace one hegemony with another. The world we have to live in will have to be a world with greater cooperation. I'm not an idealist. It's hard, but that's what we have to work towards, with supporting the multilateral system, the United Nations, because of the pandemic, the WHO, but also in trade, the WTO. There's now a very interesting discussion now about patents, the validity of patents during the pandemic. This is a discussion that everybody has to take part in. I think the US president gave a decent example, by espousing the suspension of the vaccine patents, which some developing countries had already been advocating. So these are global questions and require cooperative responses, dialogue. The international system itself has to change. I'm going to be very frank with you. Maybe my Chinese friends will not agree. We cannot deal with questions like the pandemic, climate change, without a body with power like the UN Security Council, but without the veto power. We cannot accept the veto power over the future of humanity. This is a major challenge. And China will play a huge role in this challenge. China, like every major power, it has its economic power, political power, soft power, but also military power, but also new conceptions of living. We have to deal with that. There has to be a dialectic between the US conception, more individualistic, and a more solidarity version. I'm not saying one is better than the other, but it's necessary to understand that major changes in the world has to be dealt with in this way. That's what I see. I also see that it's not a bipolar world. Russia remains a major power in the military field. The European Union is also a major economic power with all of its challenges. The developing world, in as much as it comes together and integrates, also that has some important powers in the emerging world. And that's the context Brazil has to think about. That's the context that it will be multipolar, and China will have a key role. And Brazil cannot accept the idea of Cold War and the implicit idea that you have to opt for one side or the other. If you're not with me, you're against me. Brazil wants excellent relations with China, but wants to continue having good relations with Europe and the United States, and obviously needs excellent relations in Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa and Asia, India. So in a multipolar world, that we have to recognize that China will play a key role, and it's of the interest of Brazil, not just a trade interest or the pandemic, but also to build this new world. The BRICS will be fundamental. There was a construct of the governments that I took part in as a foreign minister, and under President Dilma, it was further strengthened with the BRICS Development Bank. So that's the context that we have to work in to make this multipolar world be a world of cooperation, and the tensions and rivalries, which are inevitable, have to be dealt with, have to be tackled through dialogue with reasonableness. I want to talk a little bit more, just a little bit more about the partnership Brazil-China, because historically I have a connection to that, not way back, because that began under President Geisel during the military dictatorship, who had a decent geopolitical view. The United States had already started discussions with China, but hadn't concluded them yet. But during the Sarney government, as Science and Technology Ministry, with one of the biggest cooperation, South-South cooperation projects, for a long time, perhaps the biggest, still the biggest advanced technology, which project, South-South, which was a Chinese-Brazilian satellite project. Years later, I had the opportunity as minister of the Itamar Franco presidency to sign the strategic partnership when Jiang Zemin came to Brazil. It was the first strategic partnership that China signed with this name. So it's not something to be disparaged. A major historic view looking forward. But let's talk a little bit about trade. When we signed the strategic partnership, the bilateral trade in the two directions was $1 billion. Today, it's more than $100 billion. So huge growth. And in the multilateral forums, Brazil has had common position with China on non-intervention in internal affairs, just like we've had common positions with other countries, in common with developed countries, some capitalist countries, and we do have some common positions with them as well. So Brazil has to give major importance, the real Brazil, not necessarily the current government. The real Brazil has to lend a huge importance to relations with China. This is historic. This started under the military regime. The first civilian government, the Sarney government, had this major joint project. And then in the Itamar government in the early 90s, this formidable strategic partnership, which became deeper in the Fernando Henrique government, and then even more under the Lula government, with BRICS and the reciprocal meetings with President Hu Jintao came to Brazil, etc. And under President Dilma, which is an honor to speak after her. So I want to say that Brazil, China have to be together, have to be united towards a non-hegemonic world, a world with true respect for multilateralism, international norms, which is based on a structure of power as diffuse as possible. We know that the ideal does not exist, but bodies, institutions, forums like BRICS and others can be very important. We've seen the advances of China in trade negotiations in its region, in its continent, irrespective of ideology. And Brazil, to do justice, it has to work very hard for greater integration in South America, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And let's recognize that Kissinger used to say that China is a civilization masquerading as a country. Brazil is not that big, but Latin America and the Caribbean as a whole taken together perhaps can measure up to that. So China is a bloc, the European Union is a bloc. We need to be a major bloc in Latin America and the Caribbean, or at least in South America, to be able, together with Africa, to be able to be part of this multilateral world and make it more peaceful. And the main value should be human life. And in this way, through solidarity, through cooperation, and some competition is normal and healthy, but cooperation must prevail. That's the world we want. There's no interest in a Cold War. We mustn't be fooled by this prospect. Thank you, Minister Celso Amorim. I don't know if you're watching us now, but thank you very much for your video about the importance of multilateralism in today's world and the strategic character of relations between Brazil and China. Now we invite Professor Wang Wen of the Zhongyang Institute here in China, who will talk about the Chinese point of view about relations and contemporary geopolitics. Over to you, Professor Wang Wen.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Rousseff and all my friends. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for inviting me again to this webinar on no Cold War. Today, being able to speak after President Rousseff in the same webinar is an honor of mine. Actually, in a lot of Chinese perspective, President Rousseff is an excellent and charismatic female politician. We miss a lot the China-Brazil relationship when you're in the office. I believe tonight, all the Chinese friends who are watching this, they share the same idea. Last July 25th, the No Cold War webinar had been watched by over 200 million people of over 50 countries online. And it is a hard evidence of the great attention and support of the No Cold War received worldwide. And today with President Rousseff, the force of global peace and development is stronger. And actually the concept of no Cold War is outdated. It's just some Americans who wanted to return to the US-Soviet Cold War and continue with their hegemony. Actually, in China, the so-called New Cold War has no role at all. In the past 3 years, actually, the Trump and Pompeo kept provoking China, launching trade war, tech war, etc. But China responded calmly, without jeopardizing the overall framework of the two countries. So I think the New Cold War did not break out. Actually, data show that on 2019 and 2020, the China-US bilateral trade and investment increased, proving that people in the economic and financial circle in both countries are spending actual money in a pragmatic way, saying no to the New Cold War. So now a bunch of politicians in US, Europe, and Australia are they're role-playing Don Quixote with their spear fighting against the windmill, showing their courage and strength. And China is the imaginary windmill. And their political logic is a simple three-step. First, they will make up lies on China. For instance, Xinjiang and Hong Kong, the human rights are sabotaged, and China steals IP from other countries and trying to control the world. And second, they will strongly condemn China for the so-called crimes and openly express to the media that their judgment on China is morally correct. And third, the Congress will pass plans against China to get more funds to keep on with their schemes and conspiracy. But these are outdated frauds. More and more people have recognized that. In China, even the average netizens will think that the political tricks of US are ignorant and ridiculous and childish. They take China as the scapegoat to divert attention from their mistakes in the economic development, pandemic control, and human rights protection. Quoting Chairman Mao, all the reactionaries are paper tigers. China is not to be intimidated. In the past 7 decades, the US has conducted 4 rounds of offensives against China. 1949 to 78 military offensive, 78 to 99 ideology offensive, 92 to 2016 economic offensive, and the comprehensive offensive of Trump. But China is still standing. In the past, China was forced to participate in the Korean War and Vietnam War, defending its national security. And through reform and opening up, China promoted a new wave of rapid growth. And the Chinese companies, with their self-resilience, make China the country who has the most companies in the Fortune 500. And the 4th round of offensive is even worse. After Trump come into the office, the US mayor and used tech bans and increased taxes against China. But as we all know, the Chinese government, society, and companies have resisted the pressure and become more and more united and resilient. 2020, China is the only country in the world with positive growth in economy and foreign trade. So China's economic volume is expected to overtake US in 5 to 8 years and become the biggest economy, ending the economic domination of US in the 130 years. So with the 4 rounds of the offensive, the US has actually not taken any substantial advantage. But China's ability to play against the US has been strengthened. Now, we believe that the China's strategic posture towards the US has changed, and the era of the sole superpower has passed. The time of true multipolarity has come. It is characterized by 3 features at least. The first is the multipolarization of perceptions and the rise of the national confidence in emerging countries, especially the BRICS countries, has caused a total collapse of the fantasy of the US. The failure of US fighting against the pandemic and the selfish behavior on vaccines and the domestic governance deficiencies weaken the US soft power. US is no longer the beacon to the world. And also the decline of the G7 is faster than we could have imagined. So more and more countries will believe that they can have their own development path that fits their own national conditions. And second is the multipolarization of the economy. Emerging economies in terms of the tech innovation, demographic advantage, and economic potential will, in the past pandemic era, keep growing. And the BRICS countries and Brazil will remain the most potential emerging economy in the world. And I estimate before 2030, the top 10 economies in the world, emerging economies and the G7 countries will be half-half. And the third is the multipolarization of governance. Globalization will be based on individual regional governance, and in each region, the Western influence will decline, and they can no longer manipulate these places as it did in the past. For example, Brazil's influence on Latin America and China's influence on Asia will continue to rise. And the international organizations, they will contribute greatly to the regional equality and development. So we have to admit, for the future China-US relationship, US cannot defeat China. Of course, China, do not want a new Cold War, but China will firmly defend its national interest. So, of course, the tension will become the new normal for the China-US future relationship. I'm afraid this is something everyone will have to accept and adapt to. So I would like to share 3 conclusions of no nuclear war. First, we must see the politicians of the West. Their lies, the deceptive nature of the so-called nuclear war. They are just promoting a conspiracy against China pretentiously. We need more international peace forces like President Rousseff today, standing up against these lies and conspiracies. I think it is very important. As a Chinese scholar, I would like to give a big thumb up to Ms. Rousseff. I totally agree with everything you just said. And secondly, we must insist on opposing hegemony, promoting the true multilateralism and defending world peace. Actually, Brazil under President Rousseff's administration is very respectable. Brazil is a big country in Latin America and has played a great role in world peace and development. We have to say, in the 21st century, humanity still faces the threat to peace. For the last 20 years, US launched Afghanistan war, Iraq war, Libya war, and Syria war, etc., causing about 1 million deaths and more than 10 million refugees, creating a huge disaster to the world. So every country should draw a lesson from this. China, Brazil, every country in the world should bear the responsibility to condemn the disaster makers and encourage more countries to be independent. And third, as a Chinese scholar, I urge my foreign friends online from the English-speaking country, Portuguese-speaking country, and Spanish-speaking countries. We must believe in the dividends that China's development brings to the world, not in the irresponsible attacks on China. Just as President Rousseff said, China is rising, and China's rise is based on self-discipline. Over the past 4 decades, China has developed it rapidly without invading other countries or provoking wars or sending refugees. We commit not to be the first to use nuclear weapons and signed most international conventions. China, I think, is as peaceful as Brazil. We have made the 5-year plans, and also we set a green and low carbon goal, that is to fight against the climate change without repeating the Europe and US old path of the pollution first and regulation later. And in a consecutive 10 years, China's economic increasement contributed about 30% of the world economy and lifted 700 million people out of poverty, undertaken about 1/3 of the global infrastructure construction and investment, and created more international jobs. I think China's development path is worthy of the world's respect and worthy of more countries to learn from. And I remember President Rousseff once said something that I admire a lot. She said, "Courage is the mother of change." In 2013, Ms. Rousseff said that. I think it's a very powerful statement. I couldn't agree more. Now, I think it is a time to have the whole world pick up the courage again to fight against the hegemony, to pursue equality and a better future, to say no to the nuclear war. And in the last, I hope that we can conquer the pandemic in the near future, and we will invite Ms. Rousseff to China again with a sincere heart. And we will invite Ms. Rousseff to our university to give a lecture on our students. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Thank you very much, Professor, for having brought a contribution about the strength of the economy and Chinese society and facing up to the attacks by the United States, and recovering the economy, and the importance of creating a peaceful and multipolar future. So with this, I'm going to hand over to Professor Monica Brookman and suggest the following questions. Why does the US why is the US investing on a new Cold War against China? Does China's version of socialism bring any sort of can contribute in any way to Brazil? Good morning from Rio de Janeiro. The people from Rio say it's the most beautiful city in the world. I, as a Peruvian, humbly agree with this statement, and I'd like to say that it's a great joy to be here with President Dilma in this debate and with my colleagues Wang Wen, Elias Jabbour, and my dear comrade João Pedro Stedley. I'd like to congratulate the Tricontinental Institute for organizing these meetings in order for us to make these reflections. I'd like to start off by saying that there's a great construction, a discursive and symbolic construction regarding this reaction to the Cold War, which is increasingly divorced from the material nature of the world economy and the changes in the world. So I think there's an increasingly greater gap between this discourse and between what's actually happening in the world economy. I would synthesize these great transformations of the contemporary world model, the contemporary world economy, which we see very concretely have seen very concretely in the last 20 years. But I see two movements in this process. First of all, a displacement of the economic dynamism from the Western countries, Europe, US, to the East, especially China, but not just China. I think it's all of Southeast Asia with China's leadership, which is taking up this leadership in the economic dynamism on a global level. And secondly, the displacement of this economic dynamism from the north to the emerging south. And this is a process that precedes the pandemic. So this crisis of 2020, which is being projected to 2021-22, which is the greatest crisis since the Second World War, perhaps the third more important in the last 140 years. But I would say that this crisis is deepening and accelerating. Professor Wang Wen said that the aim is that by 2030, the Chinese economy will be the largest economy in the world in absolute terms, in gross terms. But we considered here in our analyses in Latin America, the fact that since 2014, both the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank has already placed in the ranking of the largest world economies, China at the first place. When you consider GDP measured by dollar in terms of local purchasing power. Secondly, in second place comes the United States. In 2014, some of the largest economies of the world were some of the BRICS countries, including Indonesia. The pre-COVID-19 projections for 2050, which some institutions have made in terms of forecasts of the world economy, and this process will certainly be sped up. Well, they indicate that by 2050, China will remain in first place. India possibly would come second as the second largest economy in the world, pushing the United States down to third place. And out of the 10 larger world economies in 2050, and probably before that, 7 will be countries of the global south, including one African economy, which is Nigeria, which is projected to be one of the world's largest economies. So from the developed north, only Japan, Germany, and the US will remain. These are very deep transformations of the world economy, which really shows a reorganization of the contemporary world system with implications, as President Dilma said, in the areas of geopolitics, technology, and when we analyze the capacities of scientific local scientific production. By 2012, 50% of scientists and engineers on the planet were graduating in China, and with India close second. So we can see what's happening in terms of an increasing process of weakening of the United States and a rise of the Chinese economy. And we see that the conditions of thinking, proposing, and discussing a Cold War are very limited because there's no such thing as a sort of parity of economic power with the geopolitical and diplomatic consequences that this means. If we look at the COVID-19 crisis impact on the world, there was a great reduction in the world's economy, something as like 55%, 7% for European countries in 2020. The USA, 13.5% decrease, and Southern Europe, 11%. So in a world of great economic shrinkage, the only country that most grew, over 2%, was China. So it's interesting that when we look at this recovery of the global economy, we see that for 2021, the projection is that China will grow by 8% and India by 11%. In relation to, for example, very low growth in Europe and the United States, which are growing much more slowly. So we see that the COVID crisis has had a different impact. It's impacted the developed economies of the North than the emerging economies of the South, especially the Asian one. And two of those, China and India, will be important engines to drive forward the world economic recovery. So if we look at a very important aspect to think about what is behind this discourse of the Cold War and what are the real conditions of the United States to impose a process of this nature, we can analyze, for example, the public debt of the developed countries, especially the USA, since 2001, and especially since the war against terrorism. It has increasingly accumulated public debt. In 2019, this public debt was the 13th largest in the world, which precisely to fund this process of militarization, which is so intense and acquired a new character in 2001 too. In 2020, the US leapt 4 positions and became the country with the 9th largest public debt of 127% of its GDP. And what's been recently projected by the IMF for 2021 shows that the US could close the year with a public debt of 132% of GDP. But when we look at the composition of this public debt, which is something really quite interesting, because it's partly internal but partly external. So the main debtor of the United States is Japan, and the second one is China. So I ask, what are the real conditions for the United States to impose a discourse of a post-World War II type Cold War when their economic dependence, including in terms of public debt, is really quite big? So another important question that we have to analyze in order to reply to the questions that Marcus and Tings mentioned, which is, what is the interest of the United States in putting this discourse of the Cold War on the international agenda, is to think about the increasing importance of the project of the New Silk Route as organizer of this new dynamic of the world economy, which is not just a trade dynamic and a dynamic that involves the Asian territory, but that's having a strong impact on the world system as a whole. It includes Africa and impacts directly on Latin America as well. The New Silk Route was launched as a project in 2013, less than a year later, in 2014, 21 countries were part of this agreement memorandum. And in 2020, 38 of the countries in the world were part of the new Silk Route, including 18 Latin American countries. In my opinion, Argentina is going to become the 19th country of Latin America to be part of this new Silk Route. If we see that, look at the fact that the space of diplomatic coordination and interstate coordination that's most important of the planet is the UN, with 130 countries taking part. The new Silk Route obviously becomes the second most important space for technological and diplomatic coordination, and a place for reconfiguration of territories and political spaces on a planetary level. I think it's very important to look at this on these terms, because it's becoming a great umbrella for world reorganization of world geopolitics. But there's also a way in which it's creating new instruments, which are sub-regional spaces for coordination, which President Dilma mentioned the coordination of Shanghai, which the ASEAN as well, which precedes the new Silk Route, but has become more dynamic with this Chinese project, and the Chinese-Russian relations, the BRICS and the EU, and several economic partnerships throughout the new Silk Route, both continental and maritime, and recently the RCEP launched by China, particularly at a moment of elections of the United States, which includes 13 small to medium countries of Southeast Asia, including Oceania. So it includes Oceania, which is a historically important area for the United States. The response of the US was to contain China, which was the alliance between Australia, Japan, the USA, and India, trying to contain China and the new Silk Route geopolitically and all of its developments. But this has come with many problems, because if we think, for example, of the case of Australia, Australia is a great exporter of ore, metallic and non-metallic products, which are very important on the contemporary global agenda, which has an impact on, for example, on the energetic transition, for example, the decarbonization of the economy. This was discussed in the climate summit, in which 40 countries discussed this theme and went back to an agenda that had been jettisoned in the last few years. So this decarbonization of the world economy means there's a greater demand for certain critical minerals on which low carbon technologies depend on, for example, wind and solar energy, which are needed for example, for solar panels, windmills, electric vehicles. Electric vehicles consume 5 times more of these metals than regular vehicles, and there are great reserves in Latin America, especially South America. But Australia, in spite of having small reserves, has become a great producer of these minerals for the world economy. The main destination of these exports is China. So what I ask is Australia going to stop exporting to China because now it's part of this agreement with the United States? Well, this formula has failed in the past. This formula was launched in our region, was launched in 2013 when UNASUR was starting to discuss a greater deepening of regional integration to move forward with a continental strategy for using natural resources for the good of the UNASUR. Then the United States launched an agreement with Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile, which were the governments that were then more aligned with the hemispheric vision of the United States. So, for example, Chile, which was part of the Pacific Alliance, stopped exporting, did not stop exporting copper to China, which was a way of this agreement with the United States trying to reorganize interests in the region. So I'd just like to draw attention to the great failures of the United States in the economic and political realm, in the technological realm in the last few years. So for example, 5G. NATO considers 5G an issue of national security. Its importance in the fourth industrial revolution, in the Internet of Things, in self-driving vehicles. It's great. It's a profound impact that it's going to have, including in telemedicine. But also because in Europe and the United States did not develop this technology. It was China that did. And in spite of all the commercial retaliations imposed by the United States, the main telecommunications company, which is Huawei, well, was not stopped by the United States. So any country that is going to be intends to be out of the 5G technology would be outside the possibility of being part of the technological cycles that emerge in the world economy as a whole. Where do we see these failures? Apple, which follows US policies and refuse 5G technology, has recently announced that it will produce 5G adapted telephonic technology because it simply cannot be out of this process. But it announced this after Huawei and several world companies started launching this technology. The same happened with TikTok, which is another failure of this threatening discourse of the United States regarding China's positioning in telecommunications. TikTok has become one of the largest social networks in the world, and it's created and managed by China. It was legally banned by the US, and legally this did last for more than 48 hours because it was several companies contested this, and TikTok resumed in the United States and based on United States companies. So these are important failures that show how the economic shows that the economic conditions of the US to impose a sort of discourse are increasingly weakened. And in this process of the pandemic, I think China perhaps brought forward the most important element in this conjuncture of a health crisis. In the Davos meeting a few years ago, President Xi Jinping mentioned the need of making the COVID vaccine a public good. So the possibility that there might be a break of patents of the COVID-19 vaccine, I think is a unprecedented political fact, at least in the recent history of capitalism. I think it's a moment where global capitalism is placing the defense of life before the interests of the market. I think this is an unprecedented fact if it really materializes in the agenda of the WHO and the WTO, etc. The United States has just declared its support for this, and the European Union is also coming on board. If this becomes a planetary agreement and we manage to immunize the population on a global level, which is completely indispensable to any sort of economic recovery, then we will see the limits of the system and the possibility of building a post-capitalist world. And so to move to the second question, I don't know if there are I've got some time left, Marcus, do I? I think I'm at my limit here, but just not to overlook your question completely about the importance of socialism with Chinese characteristics for Latin America. Well, I recall the declaration, the statement made by the Chinese Communist Party in their last assembly, I think it was in 2017, when among the several things that were mentioned in the final declaration was that socialism with Chinese characteristics was not just a contribution by China for itself, but for the whole world, because it would take away the capacity of seduction by capitalism throughout the world. So I think this is something interesting because China has a view of itself as a part of a larger long-term civilizatory process. If we look at what the new Silk Route it launched in 2013 means in order to reflect on China on the 21st century, we see that this new Silk Route is inspired on the old Silk Route, which came about 200 years before Christ until centuries later. So China is making use of a historical legacy in order to think about its own future and the future of the old Eurasia and the global economy as a whole. And I think this is very important to think, for us to reflect on in Latin America, which is still living under a colonial influence, especially in our thought, it's a very strong influence. Here we had civilizatory processes of great importance, which mean that our civilization is the third most ancient in the planet. And I'm sorry for my Chinese colleagues, but really it's even older than Chinese civilization. It's the civilizations on the northern coast of Peru 5 years ago and existed for almost 5,000 years with great commercial, linguistic, and intercultural exchanges in the Andes and in the Amazon, and spreading up into Central America and the Caribbean with very refined technologies, anti-seismic technologies, direct interference in the genetics of certain plants such as cotton. And this is part of a civilizatory legacy in our region, which if we really appropriate it, we can think about our historical process and our legacies in the region. And this will help us think about the possibilities of social transformations that our peoples want and need. I think the first question is related to that, with a vision of our very historical legacy in order to think about socialism in Latin America and transformation in Latin America. Secondly, what Chinese socialism brings us is a strategic view of China. And I think this is very important for us to think, because if we don't think of strategically about what sort of development we want and where we want to arrive in the 21st century, we'll not be able to think about local, regional development projects. And I think this is vital. So we do have very important and interesting legacies in our region. We were the region where, for example, the World Social Forum arose, and with its impact throughout the world, we're the region that placed the need to break with the European paradigm of a state. And I think the third element that I'd like to finish off with is that it's not enough for us to think about strategies of this type. We've got to think about concrete plans in order to take forward these strategies, and concrete instruments to take them forward as well. And one vital instrument in this process is going to be recover the vision of a sovereign integration, the projects and processes of integration that precede the 21st century and the new ones that in the 21st century as vital instruments to strengthen our region in order for us to think about it strategically and to think about our continent's participation in these profound changes in the contemporary world system. Thank you, Marcus. Thank you, Professor Monica Brookman, for your class on the contradictions and the failures, as you said, of the strategies of the empire against China, and especially for your contribution on the lessons of Chinese socialism to Brazil. And those are some of the challenges that we need and have to discuss. So now I'm going to hand over to Professor Elias Jabbour from the Communist Party of the Brazil, which is one of the great specialists of Brazil and China and has been studying China for a long time. And we're also going to suggest the same questions to you regarding the contradictions and the causes for these attacks by the USA to China. And one thing that we know that Elias knows a lot about and thinks a lot about are the lessons that Chinese socialism can bring to countries such as Brazil and countries of the global south. So now I will ask Comrade Elias to speed things up a little bit because we're going over time. So thank you very much, Elias. Over to you now. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to participate in this great event. It's a great honor for me to be here translating President Dilma Rousseff, who's part of and she lives in my heart, and she lives in my son's heart, who's only little, and she lives in the heart of all the Portuguese patriots and in the hearts of everyone who was with her in this coup process in Brazil. And she lives in my son's heart, and he's only a year and 4 months. I'd also like to greet Professor Wang Wen and Professor Monica Brookman, my comrade here in Rio de Janeiro. I also live in Rio in spite of being from São Paulo, and our great comrade and friend, João Pedro Stedley, who I have great admiration and intellectual and political respect for. And I'd like to greet Marco and Tings, and I will directly answer the 2 questions. I'm not going to beat around the bush.
So regarding the Cold War, we have to look upon the question historically. What we see today is this possibility of a new Cold War is yet another chapter of something rooted in the old Cold War with Ronald Reagan, for instance. Back then, state terrorism became an open government policy against socialism and national autonomous projects. The financing of far-right terrorist groups around the world and jihadists, like in Afghanistan during the Soviet occupation, the so-called freedom fighters, and the economic asphyxiation of third world countries using organizations like the IMF and the World Bank were fundamental in this new global strategy initiated with Ronald Reagan. So people talk a lot about Tiananmen Square, a lot of lies are told about that episode, but the fact is that 1989, the United States murdered 3,000 people while bombing Panama with the intention of toppling the president of Panama. In the same year of the episodes of the Tiananmen Square, they killed 3,000 civilians in Panama. So the 90s enshrines a fundamental leap in this strategy. I am not among those that think it's impossible. I don't think that it's impossible for there to be a new Cold War, that there are no objective conditions. I disagree. I think there are conditions for a new Cold War or new Cold Wars in the plural, even hot wars in the future, because that's in the nature of imperialism. War, it's nothing different. It's nothing outside of the imperialism. So the material interests of imperialism, of US imperialism, are directly confronted with opposite to the interests of global society. So that's the new Cold War strategy's context, which, by the way, has already become a semiotic war against China. It's the most defamed country in the world today, China. The 1990s enshrines a fundamental leap in this strategy initiated by Ronald Reagan. On the one hand, with the attempt to impose a single neoliberal line of thought, which meant backward steps that yet have to be studied by the human and social sciences. Number two, neoliberalism slash financialization became a new pattern, a new standard of accumulation, which is about blackmailing poor countries. And the third point about the 90s, the return of militarized Keynesianism, very similar to what the world had witnessed under Nazi Germany. So there was a global military dictatorship established, headed up by US imperialism. I'm going to give a very clear example here. During the Clinton era, the United States were involved in 48 military interventions, much more than during the whole of the Cold War. There were only 16 military interventions by imperialism, but only under Clinton, under the mantra of defending democracy, human rights, humanitarian wars, there were 48 military interventions. The Iraq War, the occupation of Afghanistan, they are part of this context, this attempt to impose a global military dictatorship, as I call it. And within this context that I'm putting in historical perspective, there are new modes. For example, the hybrid wars started by the Barack Obama government. I have no illusions with a democratic government, the Obama government, what it represented as a government. My country, my homeland, for instance, from 2006, especially from 2013, Brazil was the object of an intense hybrid war, which led to a coup d'etat, which led to a civilizatory backwardness of 20 steps back of 20, 30, 50 years. That's what we're experiencing in Brazil today. And we have here a person who was the main victim of this process, who is our very dear, beloved President Dilma Rousseff. In parallel with this, new hubs of power in the world emerged, especially with the growing political and economic power of the People's Republic of China, which since 1978 has gone through a new stage of development in its socialist experiment. The result is that after 40 years since this experience began, China demonstrates its superiority of socialism over capitalism. And here I can raise a few points that I think are fundamental. I'm very disciplined. I'm a follower of Lenin, so discipline is very important. I want to stay within my 12 minutes. Firstly, China demonstrates that history is not over. There's no end of history. Socialism is a possibility for the people. The superior way in which China responds to COVID-19 is a clear demonstration of the superiority of socialism. Not just that, when we look at the declaration of Xi Jinping of eradicating extreme poverty, what comes to mind is this human history that begins with the Paris Commune, then the Russian Revolution, the patriotic war of the Soviet people, the Stalingrad, the Sputnik launch. This happening, which was the overcoming of extreme poverty under Xi Jinping's leadership, is part of this human journey that begins in 1870. The superiority of socialism is expressed through an amazing capacity to articulate, to coordinate between the different institutional frameworks, which is summarized in the partnership between the Communist Party, 96 public conglomerates, and the unity between the people and the state. So in the last 25 years, I have sought to demonstrate that socialism is feasible in the economy, in society. It is a science and must be treated as such. And this is what I study. Based on this initial abstraction, I study the Chinese case. Chinese socialism inaugurates human reason as an instrument of government. So disruptive technologies bring about new forms of economic planning in China. These innovations, these disruptive technologies that emerged in China, by raising the capacity of economic planning of the Chinese economy, also demonstrate an increase of human capacity of intervening in nature. And these new and higher forms of economic planning were put to the test during the pandemic and were successful. So socialism as a project of abolition of private property is a long-term process. Before we get there, when it's possible to absorb and overcome the idea of private property, that socialism appears with different historical formats. And the current format is under the transformation of reason into an instrument of government. Because, for example, President Dilma, comrades of the panel, 40,000 high-speed rail tracks in 20 years demonstrate not just a figure, it's a clear demonstration of what I would call the transformation of reason into a tool of government. And that is how socialism is presenting itself before the world as superior to capitalism. I say this because it's necessary to have a new synthesis of the historical forms of socialism and how it presents itself to humanity. This is a key subject for social scientists of the progressive field to study Chinese socialism with a very advanced social engineering for our historical epoch. The Chinese experience gives us sufficient material to formulate a new synthesis about historical forms that socialism represents in our era. I believe that there are new regularities, economic regularities that are emerging in China. I cannot separate theory from history. In as much as the country advances over 40 years, the theories must accompany this process of evolution. So China provides enough material for new theoretical syntheses to emerge to explain the process and to update and demonstrate that socialism is far from being a utopia. It is possible. It is something to be built historically. It is the future we expect. To say no to a new Cold War means safeguarding the interests of humanity that are attached to the Chinese experience. The new Cold War is part of the escalation against the peoples of reaffirmation of US imperialism as a global military dictatorship that is ready to go to war against socialism and humankind itself. So I want to say a special thank you for the invitation. Fraternal greetings to President Dilma Rousseff, Professor Wang Wen, Professor Monica Brookman, Comrade João Pedro Stelligley, Tricontinental Institute, Marco Fernandes, and Tings Chak. Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Elias, for your contribution about the new modes of action of the empire, the so-called hybrid wars that we've witnessed in Brazil and now against China, and particularly the perspective of building socialism as a new model of society